Good morning. My name is Nora Mulligan, and I am a board member this morning, the vice president of the board. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of the Hudson Valley. Yay. And welcome back. Whether you have been with this congregation a decade or more, or this is your first time visiting, we welcome you. Whatever the faith and traditions of your past, we welcome you. Whatever your theological stance, we welcome you. Whoever you are and whomever you love, we welcome you. Whatever your heritage, we welcome you. We respectfully acknowledge the territory on which our church building sits as the ancestral homelands of the Munsee, Lenape, and Wappinger people. There are a couple of announcements. Susie and Linda will be going around after the service and asking people to volunteer for donations of art supplies, materials, and help to join in work on the newest public display project that the group is doing. Also, Terry Lucan will be selling grocery cards. Please either see her after the service or send her an email to order grocery cards. For the most up-to-date information on these topics and others, please refer to our weekly e-newsletter and check our website frequently. And please join us, those of you who are watching could join us for virtual coffee hour after the service. Stay on the line, you'll be directed where to go. It will be one Zoom, there will not be breakout rooms. For those of you in the sanctuary, we will have we can gather outside. We can gather outside. If you're just recently joining us and would like to receive our weekly e-news, please email us at ucroton@gmail.com with your name, and we will make sure that you're added to our email list. Once again, we welcome you to the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of the Hudson Valley.
We have come into this room of hope, where our hearts and minds are opened to the future. We have come into this room of justice, where we set aside our fear to freely name every oppression. We've come into this room of love, where we know that no lives are insignificant. We've come into this room of song, where we unite our voices in the somber and beautiful melodies of life. We have come into this room. We are here. We are together. Let us begin.
Our chalice lighting today is by Christine Robinson. In our time of grief, we light a flame of sharing, the flame of ongoing life. In this time when we search for understanding and serenity in the face of loss, we light this sign of our quest for truth, meaning, and community. Now please join me in the unison affirmation, which you can find in your order of service. Inspired by love, our mission is to seek our true nature, connect deeply and openly, and act for justice. Let us now bear witness to the joys and sorrows experienced in our community. If you have a personally significant joy or sorrow, we would like you to line up on my left in this aisle. That would be your right. Please maintain social distancing. Please leave your mask on at all times, even when you are speaking into the microphone. I will then light a candle for your joy or sorrow. If you would prefer to have me light a candle in silence, you may stand up in front of your pew, and I will do that as well. When you have finished speaking, please exit the microphone and go up the center aisle back to your seat. Please make sure that you speak loudly, since you will be leaving your mask on. So we want to make sure that not only everyone here in the sanctuary hears you, but that everyone at home can hear you as well. I will begin. Please start lining up, and I will start things off Unfortunately, I do have a sorrow to share today. A very good friend of my next door neighbor, who I am very good friends with, and I know this person as well. We've been to a number of events together. Unfortunately suffered a massive heart attack yesterday, and to my knowledge, he is still fighting for life. He's in the ICU, he is not conscious, he is intubated. I don't know his status as of this morning, but that was his status as of last night. His name is Sal. He's only in his early 60s. He has a wife and 2 young adult sons, so please keep him in your thoughts. Thank you.
Just one thing to add to what the instructions Ann gave before. You'll notice that my voice is not projecting through the sound system in this room, but it is going to our live stream, people. Hello. So be sure to speak appropriately. I knew that because of my joy this morning, which is that Chris Oliver is our live stream technician. For your more than capable volunteering this morning and in future Sundays. We're very, very appreciative.
Oh.
I have 2 joys. The first one is that today is my daughter's wedding anniversary. She and her wife have been married 6 years. And my second joy is that I have recovered from my appendicitis and my emergency operation, and I'm going back to work tomorrow. Thank you.
So, because today is like the first Sunday of UU, I thought of Susan Pete and how she always looks so good. And in fact, by her own admission, after her first time here, she said, "Don't these people dress up for church?" So, in honor of her, I'm wearing a dress today.
Good morning, I'm Susie Dugas. I had a joy. Last weekend I attended the Rhythm and Roots Music Festival in camp for the first time with friends. It was really fun for 3 days. And of course, I usually call it the Zydeco Festival because I just do Zydeco dancing, but it's actually the Rhythm and Roots Festival. Thank you.
I'm Shaking Matt Cindy here, sharing a joy. My best friend since high school, who came over to the state of New York with me from Colorado, has recently returned from law school. She was going to school in North Carolina, and now she is back in the state. So I've been able to see her a few times. Just really glad to keep that, enduring friendship going.
I have a sorrow and many joys. The sorrow is that my sister Patty from Virginia is being treated for colon cancer and isn't doing well. It's very tough on her. But the joy is that we just got back from 5 weeks at the family cottage in Maine, where I saw 2 of my other siblings and spent time with my son and his family, and Ginny's son and his family, and lots of nieces and nephews, and we had a wonderful time up there.
Hi, I'm Linda Carol-Nicholas, and my sorrow is that my sister-in-law, who we dearly love, passed away
And we had a really, when I was growing up, he was the one who always took all the pictures of family functions. He was just really there for our family, so I want to remember Uncle Scott today.
And now I will light one more candle for all the unspoken joys and sorrows held within the sanctuary of our hearts. And one more for all those who have yet to find a spiritual home where they too can share their joys and sorrows.
I invite you now to join in the spirit of meditation. You may wish to do so by sitting up a little straighter, putting your feet flat on the floor to ground you to the earth. Close your eyes if you wish, or slowly take in a nice deep breath and gently release it, releasing all of the stress of the week. We all live in an assumptive world where, in order to contain and function, we trust that our loved ones are reasonably safe. Otherwise, we'd be crippled by anxiety all the time. When that assumptive world is shattered by inexplicable violence, that of one human being against his fellows, it is a seismic shock to the psyche. This is true even in locales where violence of war is nearly constant. People still want to believe, not me, not my family. One spiritual teacher on his deathbed was asked what wise phrase he could pass on to those he left behind. "Pay attention," was his reply. Our attention is so often on the past or the future, up in our heads or on someone else's business. What does it mean to be present, as they say? To know it when you see it is my experience. You also know it when you're in it, the state of presence. Both seeing it and being in it are commonplace around deathbeds where there is an opportunity for anticipatory grief. When people know that they are going to lose a loved one, they pay exquisite attention to them. Often their grief is compounded by the awareness that they were inattentive when the loved one was well. We can spare ourselves much future grief by paying exquisite attention now, not only to our loved ones, but also to our fellow travelers, wherever we may meet them. Let us be together now in a moment of silent meditation.
Our reading today is called Belonging is Stronger Than Facts is the Age of Misinformation. And this is written by Max Fisher. There's a decent chance you've had at least one of these rumors, heard at least one of these rumors, all false, relayed to you as fact recently. That President Biden plans to force Americans to eat less meat, that Virginia is eliminating advanced math in schools to advance racial equality, and that border officials are mass purchasing copies of Vice President Kamala Harris's book to hand out to refugee children. All were amplified by partisan actors, but you're just as likely, if not more so, to have heard it relayed from someone you know. And you may have noticed that these cycles of falsehood-fueled outrage keep recurring. We are in an era of endemic misinformation and outright disinformation. Plenty of bad actors are helping the trend along, but the real drivers, some experts believe, are social and psychological forces that make people prone to sharing and believing misinformation in the first place. And those forces are on the rise. Why are misperceptions about contentious issues in politics and science seemingly so persistent and difficult to correct? Brendan Nyan, a Dartmouth College political scientist, posed in a new paper in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Put more simply, people become more prone to misinformation when three things happen. First, and perhaps most important, is when conditions in society make people feel a greater need for what social scientists call in-grouping, a belief that their social identity is a source of strength and superiority, and that other groups can be blamed for their problems. As much as we like to think of ourselves as rational beings who put truth-seeking above all else, we are social animals wired for survival. In times of perceived conflict or social change, we seek security in groups, and that makes us eager to consume information, true or not, that lets us see the world as a conflict, putting our righteous in-group against a nefarious out-group. This need can emerge especially out of a sense of social destabilization. As a result, misinformation is often prevalent among communities that feel destabilized by unwanted change, or, in the case of some minorities, powerless in the face of dominant forces. Framing everything as a grand conflict against scheming enemies can feel enormously reassuring. And that's why perhaps the greatest culprit of our era of misinformation may be, more than any one particular misinformer, the era-defining rise in social polarization. At the mass level, greater partisan divisions in social identity are generating intense hostility toward opposition partisans, which has seemingly increased the political system's vulnerability to partisan misinformation, Dr. Nyan wrote in an earlier paper. Growing hostility between the two halves of America feeds social distrust, which makes people more prone to rumor and falsehood. It also makes people cling much more tightly to their partisan identities. And once our brains switch into identity-based conflict mode, we become desperately hungry for misinformation that will affirm that sense of us versus them, and much less concerned about things like truth or accuracy. The problem is that when we encounter opposing views in the age and context of social media, it's not like reading them in a newspaper while sitting alone, the sociologist Zeynep Tukafe wrote in a much circulated MIT Technology Review article. It's like hearing them from the opposing team while sitting with our fellow fans in a football stadium. Online, we're connected with our communities, and we seek approval from our like-minded peers. We bond with our team by yelling at the fans of the other one. In an ecosystem where that sense of identity conflict is all-consuming, she wrote, Belonging is stronger than facts.
Although Michigan's win yesterday and Ohio State's upset loss did prove to me that God exists, so I was quite happy yesterday. Anyway, when I was in high school, I had an assignment for my American history class to interview a veteran of World War II. And in those days, vets of the Second World War were far more numerous than they are today. I chose the obvious candidate to me, which was my maternal grandfather. He'd been telling me stories about the war in my youth long before I ever had it as an assignment. He was the only person I knew who had a tattoo, albeit a somewhat diffuse one by the time I saw it, a reminder of his time spent in the Navy. There are many things my grandfather taught me or told me about his time in the military and fighting in the war. He was not often a reflective man, but this was one of the rare exceptions. My grandfather enlisted shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and ironically, that was where he was stationed. Hawaii makes an impression on a young man in his early 20s from small town Ohio. And he showed me pictures of battleships. He worked on repairing ships that came back to Pearl Harbor after they had fought in the Pacific. And these were in the form of postcards that he had that showed these large ships with these huge cannons. You've probably seen this with like 3 cannons kind of coming out at all angles. And these ships would fire these enormous guns at Japanese ships and airplanes, so much so that they would overheat. And the casings of the battleship guns would begin to melt under the intense heat of constant firing. And more than once, these ships, which looked so perfect and so gleaming in these postcards, would limp back into port for repairs. And the metal casings on the guns, as I mentioned, would melt and would be drooping over the sides of the ship like cooked spaghetti. And while he had no pictures of that, of the ships in that particular state, it was kind of an image that probably more powerful because I had to imagine it, right? It was in my imagination as this image that never left me. World War II was perhaps the defining moment of the 20th century. Then surely 9/11 was the event for the 21st century. 20 years ago, and 20 years and one day ago, terrorists from numerous countries, but forming a cell of the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda, which means the base or the foundation, hijacked 4 planes leaving the East Coast for the West Coast. That meant that those 4 planes had a great deal of jet fuel inside of them. 2 of the planes were flown into the 2 towers of the World Trade Center, a symbol of American economic dominance. The other 2 were intended for the Capitol building and the White House, both in Washington, D.C. One plane was overtaken by the passengers and forced to crash in southeastern Pennsylvania. Fearing he could not make the White House, the pilot of one plane crashed it into the Pentagon. This was terrorism at a massive scale. No one had ever conceived of a plan so widespread and intricate before, much less to be executed on American soil. An attack on the World Trade Center had been done in 1993, but the perpetrator was caught. Interestingly, it was the nephew of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the architect of the 9/11 attacks. It's hard to describe the shock and confusion of that day, and honestly, of the days to follow. Here was a new kind of war that we were just beginning to wrap our heads around. No more could we feel safe from the comfort of 2 oceans on either side of our continent. This was an act of war, but it was a vastly different kind of war from the kind that my grandfather volunteered for and fought in his youth. The sides were murkier, the victories less clear, yet the defeats were obvious to all. Like most of you, I'm sure, I remember very clearly what I was doing on the morning of September 11th, 2001. I was in Omaha, Nebraska. It was the fall of my second year in ministry. This meant that, and that meant I was on Central Time, so I awoke to the news that planes had struck the World Trade Center. I didn't really have anything on my agenda that day, but I turned on the news that morning, and I didn't turn it off until that evening. I waited by the phone to talk to family and friends, to be available to congregants who needed comfort. Back in those days, I didn't have a cell phone. I think only one person actually did call me. I watched as I saw that second plane hit the other tower just moments before. They were both burning, and eventually I watched them both crumble down and fall like sandcastles at the beach. Indeed, I watched way too much TV that day. Eventually, I had to turn it off and watch something else, anything else. One of the few channels not showing the attacks and the aftermath of the towers was, and I don't remember the channel, it was just one of those obscure channels you never watch that's way up the dial on cable TV, and was showing, of all things, Star Trek V, which is by far the worst of the Star Trek movies. I didn't care. I watched the second half of it anyway, just to get a break from that unrelenting reality of fear and suffering. And ironically, for those of you perhaps not as familiar with Star Trek V, thankfully, Captain Kirk, in the climax of that movie, eventually has an argument and then a fight with a being that claims to be God. Kind of a fitting metaphor for the day. Now, not many know this, but Omaha did have a connection to 9/11. Just south of Omaha is a small town called Bellevue, Nebraska, which is home to SAC, Strategic Air Command. And in the event of intercontinental nuclear warfare, Strategic Air Command becomes headquarters for the military. When we went to war in Iraq, I remember talking to my board president at the time, colonel in the Air Force Reserves, and I said to him, hey man, are you going to get called up for this war we're doing over in Iraq and get shipped overseas? And he said, well, that's pretty unlikely. My primary job is target selection for nuclear missiles. I was very glad he did not get called up into out of the reserves. But as a result, Omaha is a secure location for the president in the event of an attack on the United States. George W. Bush was flown there, spent a few hours in Nebraska before getting the all clear and returning to the White House. Now, most of the country, I realized it was different here because so many folks knew people and it happened in New York. But for so much of the country, 9/11 was experienced much the same way I experienced it, which was on TV and in the media. And as a result, some of it seemed unreal. Literally so strange and unprecedented. It broke every frame of reference one had. After 9/11, we lived in a different fundamental worldview than we had on September 10th. I remember I did not cry on 9/11. Actually, I hadn't realized that I hadn't cried on 9/11 until a few years later on one of the anniversaries. And for a long time, I felt bad about this, as if I didn't feel bad enough about what happened, or that there was some sort of emotional deficit inside of me. I think it was because 9/11 kind of happened at a distance. I didn't doubt that it had occurred. I'm not one for conspiracy theories like that, but somehow it failed to connect with me at a heart level. The French post-structuralist philosopher Jean Baudrillard wrote extensively on signs and symbols and what they mean or fail to mean, particularly in our media and popular culture. He wrote about some of this phenomenon that I was experiencing a few years before in a book that he entitled "The Gulf War Did Not Happen." And in it he notes that the Persian Gulf War was the first to be fully televised The war occurred through the media for most of the Western world. No one came knocking on our door to seize our belongings or kill our children. It was clean, it was sanitized. We saw what the government wanted us to see. We experienced it through the lens of a media 24-hour news cycle that needed to be fed. And whether these events happened or not was unknown to us because there was no referent, as he called it, or grounding in actual fact or reality. We never got that experience. Thus, the whole thing was a narrative on TV, referring to only itself, a state that he called hyperreality. Hyperreality is when symbols and signs refer only to other symbols and signs. Language and media attempt to describe actual reality, but always fall short of it. What they describe is an approximation, a simulation, if you will, of reality. In his book, Simulacra and Simulation, Baudrillard calls this the desert of the real, a term maybe familiar to you. It was used in a movie based on Baudrillard's work called The Matrix. Now, this may seem like the peculiar musings of an obscure French philosopher, except I believe that Baudrillard was literally ahead of his time. We live now today in the dystopia that he warned us about. We don't use his terms, but we're very familiar with his ideas. In fact, our political rhetoric is chock full of them. Instead of hyper-reality, we now call it fake news. Or better yet, alternative facts, things that refer to themselves but never to actual reality. When reality becomes uncomfortable or inconvenient, we reframe it, mislabel it, brush it aside. The comedian John Mulaney once noted, all of the times we spend online verifying to our identities on various websites. Just think, he says, we regularly now have to prove to robots that we are not a robot. We know now that bots from Russia and China, and probably America too, can mimic human behavior and writing such that other humans can't tell the difference. That is the definition of a simulacrum. Now, why do these bots do it? What's to be gained from this hyper-reality or fake news, if you want to call it that? It's simple: to divide us, to sow fear and mistrust of the other, which incidentally was the primary motive of the 9/11 terrorists as well. As we heard in our reading this morning, division is that state of our political reality. We didn't just get here by accident. Now, last June, when I last saw all of you, when I was here for our hybrid services, Sherry and I spent a day in Manhattan. It was my first time visiting New York City, and our guide was Sherry's childhood friend, Kathy, who has lived in New York City for decades now. And she asked us, what did we want to see? And the number one thing for me was the 9/11 Museum. The current footprint of where the two towers stood are now reflecting pools with the names of the victims engraved upon it. The museum itself is inside where the World Trade Center was, and they give you a fairly precise location of where you would have been inside the original building. Art Spiegelman, one of the masters of the graphic novel, wrote and illustrated a book entitled In the Shadow of No Towers, a phrase and image that perfectly captures what it's like to walk around that part of the city. The primary exhibit is a minute-by-minute account of the events of 9/11, including what was being said on the radio and TV at the time. It is a powerful place. In fact, Kathy left the exhibit after only a few minutes. This is encouraged, actually, by both signs and docents alike. I lived it once, I don't need to live it again, she said. A couple things stood out for me. One was seeing a steel girder bent in half. Immediately, it called to mind the description my grandfather gave me of those cannons on board the World War II battleships that bent like spaghetti after being fired too often. This girder looked just like those cannons in my imagination. According to the exhibit, the intense heat of burning jet fuel, along with unbelievable force and pressure caused by the compression of the building collapsing, bent this girder like it was a piece of clay. The exhibit was such that while you couldn't take pictures or videos, you can touch things. And I'll never forget seeing and then touching that bent girder. At that moment, 9/11 could never be a distant event simulated on television. This was a referent, grounded in reality, to use Baudrillard's terms. You can't deny away a girder bent like it's spaghetti, not after you've seen it and touched it with your own hands, as I did. It confirmed to me something that I've often said in the midst of political rhetoric of the recent past, that reality has a way of dramatically bursting through our delusions. The other significant moment for me was very early on in the museum, when you walk down the stairs to the main floor. On the left, and you may have seen pictures of this. This is kind of a famous picture of the museum. But on the left is a mosaic of blue tiles, each a slightly different shade of blue, individually representing each of the victims of the attacks, and collectively meant to represent the clear blue, bright blue sky on September 11th. And in the middle of this mosaic is a line from Virgil in the Aeneid: "No day shall erase no day shall erase you from the memory of time." And I ask, how could anyone not weep at the sight of such a sad and beautiful piece of art? I surely did. Museums, of course, present facts as best they can. They try to teach by stitching together a narrative and leave it to the customer or the client or whatever they call you to have your reaction to whatever's being presented. I thought the museum did an exceptional job staying neutral and presenting facts of what the hijackers did and their plans. But at the end of the day, it's hard not to have an intensely emotional reaction to seeing the reality of 9/11 presented to you, New Yorker or no. This included also, the timeline kept going beyond 9/11. It included the days after that event, in the ways in which Americans came together following those attacks. For once, there was unity rather than division in our country, even at the political level. 20 years after 9/11, I think that is what gives me hope, that the forces that seek to harm America know that their goals are accomplished more readily when we fear each other and turn on each other. The unity following 9/11 demonstrates that we can live and work for each other across all kinds of dividing lines. If it happened once, it can happen again, but we need to let go of those partisan divisions we seem to be so psychologically stuck to, according to our reading. Our desire to be in one group over and against another. Our identity needs to be grounded in something greater, dare I say, even spiritual, rather than the divisions necessitated by our politics. On this anniversary, let us never forget those who died. May their legacy be an inspiration to us, and may the vision of a nation made whole in spirit guide us into the future. I love you. Go in peace. Amen.
Each week we make an offering from the bounty that we are blessed to enjoy. We do this in a spirit of love and generosity, aware that we have benefited from those who have gone before, those who in their turn gave generously. Our offering goes to support the work of love and justice undertaken by this community. Today's offering will also be shared with the UUSC in support of their efforts in the aftermath of the earthquake in Haiti, Afghan refugees, and New Orleans after Hurricane Ida. There are multiple ways to contribute today. The plate will be passed once again. You are welcome to put cash or a check in that if you are here in the sanctuary. You may also contribute via credit card or PayPal, and there are multiple ways to do that as well. If you have an order of service, we have a lovely QR code that you can now use. Welcome to the 21st century, everyone. If you are at home or not, you can also make your donation using the links in your newsletter and on our website as well. Of course, you can also always mail us a check. If you're donating by credit card or PayPal, please remember to give a little bit extra to make up for the 3% surcharge. The offering will now be given and gratefully received. Please join me now in the dedication of the offering. The words can be found in your order of service. May these gifts and the work of our hands and hearts give power to all we stand for as a community of faith. Now please join me in extinguishing the chalice. The words are again in your order of service. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
Let us go forth with hope in our hearts, warmth in our friendships, and determination in our choice to be a part of the process of making this a better and safer world, a world where peace and understanding can be the common denominator of all human interaction. Amen. Amen.